So thanks everyone for joining. My name's Brooke Edmonds. I'm with OSU Extension, and I'm moderating this webinar series. And so today I'm really pleased to welcome Nicole Sanchez. I have her little bio here I'm going to read for you as our speaker today. And so Nicole is a newer assistant professor in the Oregon State University Department of Horticulture, and she's based at the Klamath Agricultural Experiment Station. Her program focuses on home and small-scale commercial horticultural production and management issues. She comes to us by way of the Southeast U.S., where she had diverse horticulture and extension experiences. So we'll let Nicole share her screen and unmute herself and take it away for us today.
Yes. All right. Great. Well, thank you for having me. I'm very interested in this particular topic. As we will discuss, we realized that the Bronze Birch Borer was here in Klamath Falls last year, and that's brought up lots of great information in terms of management that we thought would be helpful to share with master gardeners elsewhere. So to get us started, here we go. Sorry about that. So I just want to go over some brief goals. So hopefully by the end of this discussion, you'll be able to identify the Bronze Birch Borer and probably more importantly, the signs of its damage, and to understand how the Bronze Birch Borer's life cycle makes that damage hard to see and diagnose. We'll talk about some options for treatment and hopefully understand the pollinator-related challenges that are associated with chemical treatment of Bronze Birch Borer. At the end, I've also got some reference material that should be helpful for us that are trying to help homeowners navigate this particular situation. So we got to start out by identifying our pest. The Bronze Birch Borer, or I may refer to it as the BBB for short, is a beetle in the family Buprestidae. Its scientific name is Agaricus anxius, and its family, the Buprestidae family, is a pretty large beetle family, and Agaricus is a pretty large genus within that family. All of these buprestids, the larvae are generally known as flat-headed borers. You might be able to tell from the picture there, pointing down is the head end of that larva, and it tends to be widened and flattened, which distinguishes it from some of the other beetle larvae that we may find feeding in similar areas of a tree. The adults are generally a wedge-shaped beetle. They tend to be broader at the front end and then taper to a point at the end. And lots of them are metallic. So some of these are actually common as jewelry. I wish I still had the buprestid beetle that I got in Thailand that was actually made into a pen. It was so cool. This particular buprestid in most parts of the U.S. is going to have up to a 2-year life cycle. In some of the warmer parts, like my native Southeast U.S., it may develop fully in a year. And it's important to understand that most of that life cycle is happening inside the tree. And so the larvae are the most destructive part of the life cycle. The adults are what we most readily see, but they're not the part that's normally doing the damage. So just to give you an idea of what that family looks like, again, you see that kind of football shape that's more tapered at one end. So this just represents some of the diversity in that group. Lots of metallics, and you might be able to make out another common feature of this family on a few of these pictures, and that's the antennae that look a lot like little saws. The antennae are very serrated looking. I want to point out, remember we mentioned that this is a pretty large genus, that we do have some other insects in this same genus that are problematic across the country. And it's helpful to understand that a lot of the treatment information and considerations that we would have about Bronze Birch Borer would also apply in part to some of these other pests. So within the same genus that the Bronze Birch Borer belongs to, Agaricus, we also have Agaricus bilineatus. That one's called the two-lined chestnut borer, and it feeds on several trees like chestnuts, oaks, and beeches. We don't see that one in the Pacific Northwest. It's a little easier to pick out because of those two lines that run parallel from the head down to the end of the wing. We've also got one that feeds only on dogwoods. It's west to at least the Great Plains, but not on the most western part of the country yet. We've got Agrulus planipinus, which is the emerald ash borer, and that's a member of this particular genus that lots of people are on the lookout for. So this one is an invasive, where the bronze birch borer is actually native to the U.S. It was introduced to the U.S. in the early 2000s, and it kills lots of ash trees. In places where the emerald ash borer has become established, it's almost impossible to grow an ash tree in those areas. So that's one to be on the lookout for. Then we've got Granulatus granulatus, and that's not a typo. That's actually a subspecies of the poplar borer. There's between the subspecies of the poplar borers, we've got those pretty much all over North America, but they're not feeding on birch. They look very similar to BBB, but they're feeding on different trees. And then there are some members of this family that aren't feeding on trees. The redneck cane borer, which I used to encounter in the South, ironically, Agrulus ruficolus, is a raspberry and blackberry feeder. And I used to get this one in my blackberries in North Carolina all the time. So it's a pretty big family. The one that we're probably most likely to confuse with BBB is the subspecies of granulatus. So you've got a picture there of one of them. Again, this is feeding on aspens, cottonwoods, and poplars. And if you look closely, you'll see that there's a few dots on the elytra of the Agrulus granulatus. The bronze birch borer does not have those dots on the elytra, so that can be something that we can use to distinguish those folks. So bronze birch borer is actually native to the United States. It is not invasive. However, it does seem in Oregon to be spreading its range right now. So it was first detected in Portland in 2003, in Eugene and in the Central Oregon area in the 2000s, 2007 to 2009, and then we just realized that we had it here in Klamath Falls last year. In talking with my colleagues, one of the reasons that I felt like it was so important to get the word out about this particular pest is that in Central Oregon, when bronze birch borer arrived, it led to a loss of 70% of ornamental birches in the landscape, and that's a really significant number. And that's a pretty popular ornamental tree in our area and other parts of Oregon. So we felt like it was really important for people to be aware that this particular pest is spreading in the state. So because there are some other invasives that are potentially more problematic, it's not particularly an ODA focus at this time. So there's not a campaign for this pest like there would be, say, for the emerald ash borer in terms of detection and understanding where the spread is on a statewide level. So let's move into looking at the BBB life cycle. Before we get into that, Brooke, are you seeing any questions on just understanding what bronze birch borer is? Not so far? Okay, great. So the life cycle with this pest starts with eggs. On the smaller trees, the eggs may be laid right on the trunk. On larger trees, you typically see those eggs laid on the base of branches at the trunk. And so the larva will actually bore into the trunk at its base. And you can see from the picture there of the egg that it's kind of nondescript and just looks like maybe a little something stuck on the bark. On a white birch, it's a little easier to see, but if this was on one of the darker barked birch trees, that egg would actually be pretty tough to see. So these eggs are laid in the summer. And one of the challenges for treating this pest is that one of our options allows us to treat on the trunk, but we have to know when the eggs are being laid in order for that particular treatment to be effective. So like many integrated pest management approaches, timing is everything with this particular pest, and we'll focus more on that when we talk about what homeowner options might be. So the larvae hatch from the eggs, they burrow into the bark, and they feed in the cambium, which, as many of you know, is right where the water and nutrient exchange in the tree is going on. And so in cooler parts of the country, this feeding in the cambium of the tree is going on for 2 whole seasons, 2 years before the adults emerge. So, and again, in some warmer parts of the country, that process might take only 1 year, but the larvae are going to pupate the second winter, and then the adults will emerge in the summer. So again, you have the eggs there, you have a picture of the larva, and hopefully you can see that tapered and flattened head. Then you see the pupa there that has nestled right inside the cambium to finish out its development, and then the adult, which is going to emerge usually from a hole that you can usually make out a distinguished D shape. So that D shape that you see on the bark, there are 2 of them very close together on this particular picture. That D shape is characteristic of all of the buprestids. Okay, so sometimes it is a little harder to make out that flattened side of the D, but that is an emergence hole that is common to everybody in that family. So that is something that's going to play across some of these other species that we talked about as well. So it is good to know that there are some birches that are less susceptible than others might be. So river birch is the least susceptible to this particular pest. I know I spent a lot of time in the southeast. The river birch is really the only birch I remember ever seeing much in the industry. Because of the longer growing season, bronze birch borer can knock some of those other trees out very quickly. We know that the white birches are the most susceptible to this particular pest, and that our native birches tend to be less susceptible than the European type. So the white birch is more susceptible, generally speaking, and the natives are a little less susceptible than some of our European types. We do see other trees that are being damaged by buprestids generally. Those are going to be other buprestids. And in the case of some of them, you typically see those on older trees, and you may see a few branches that are in decline from the pest, but it's less usual for them to kill the entire tree. And all buprestids generally attack trees that are older or suffering from drought or have some other stress upon them, so they tend to hone in on those trees. So this link to this Forest Service leaflet, it is mentioned again at the end here, has some more detailed information about those specific types of birches that might be more and less susceptible. One of our strategies in an IPM focus would be to encourage folks to use birches that are less susceptible in areas where we know this particular pest is a problem, instead of continuing to plant those same birches that are susceptible, which in our area tend to also be the more popular ones for our area. But we can kind of guide choices to some birches that may be less problematic. So here you have some pictures of some of the damage, and we start to get into why this particular pest can be really tough and why it can be in our yards without us noticing it. So on the left, you have a young birch tree, and if you look very closely, you can see some kind of warbled or raised spots underneath of that bark. And if you use your imagination, you may be able even to discern a little bit of a zigzag pattern underneath of that bark on that young tree. Remember, the feeding's going on under the bark. Many of you that are familiar with birches know that the bark is kind of, it can kind of look like that naturally. And some of the birches have exfoliating barks and kind of rumpled barks that are something that gives it interest. So it can be kind of hard to pick that out at first. The zigzag is kind of a giveaway as opposed to those raised areas just being in one spot. And we can also press against some of these, and you can actually feel that there's give underneath of some of those warbles there, I like to call them. So in the central picture there, you can see that the culprit is this larva, this flat-headed larva that's feeding underneath of the bark. So to be sure that this guy is there, then you're typically going to be doing some invasive diagnostic there, right? So to be able to see that actual critter, you've actually peeled that bark away. Homeowners are going to be reluctant to do that because they're not going to want to peel all the bark away and leave that exposed. But we have a picture at the bottom there so that you can see what that looks like. And again, I mentioned that zigzag. So it's not a perfect zigzag, but you can make out that back and forth feeding pattern. And that too is typical of buprested beetle feeding. On small branches that come off of the trunk of more mature trees, another thing that they'll do is go around and around and around the base of that branch. And that's why one of the first things that you can see in a tree at sometimes is a single branch in an otherwise healthy tree that's completely brown. So that larva may feed in basically a circle girdling that particular twig. It's completely cutting off all water and nutrient exchange to that one twig or branch. You typically see that higher up in the canopy of the tree, and that's often one of the first things that people notice, because unless we're looking really closely, a lot of folks aren't going to notice those warbles in the bark first, right? But as they pull into the driveway and see their tree in its hole, they might notice and wonder why that one branch has turned brown and died. So again, the bronze birch borer is feeding in that cambial layer. So you can see here an example of that destructive diagnostic that can show you that that feeding is going on. I do want to take just a moment to contrast that to some other bark beetles that you're likely to see in ornamental trees. Depending on the pronunciation, you might hear them called the scalitids or the scaletids. Well, we have a whole range of bark beetles in that family, different family from the buprestids, that feed in the same area. But as you can see from the picture on the right of your screen, that their feeding pattern is very different. So the buprestids generally lay their eggs in ones or twos. The larvae burrow into the cambium and feed in single tunnels. With the scalitids, the eggs are laid in mass in one central gallery, and when they hatch, the little larvae tunnel out from that central gallery in all different directions. Can you see where that's a very different pattern? And so if you do get to where diagnostic removal of bark is something that's helpful, or if the tree is already on the way out and you've got branches to work with, that particular feeding pattern can make it pretty easy for you to distinguish between those two families. So what are people going to see from the outside of the tree? Something that I'm seeing a lot of in Klamath Falls is trees that are partially green but have whole areas of them that are clearly not getting water and not getting nutrients. And here in Klamath Falls, where we don't get very much water in the summertime, it can be tricky with early bronze birch borer damage to tell the difference between a tree that has drought and is just not getting water and one that actually has damage. Before it gets to the stage that you're looking at here in the first picture on this slide, you start to see just individual branches. Or you may see parts of the tree that are flagging in the heat of the day. So the leaves just look really droopy, the tree just looks a little tired. One of the things that we can use to determine whether or not it might be just drought as opposed to the bronze birch borer is typically a tree that is just water stressed. Looks better early in the morning and late in the day. When it cools down, it may not look quite as droopy, where one that's got the bronze birch borer on it is going to droop all of the time. Eventually, those leaf-bearing branches and the brown and the droopy leaves are going to spread over more and more of the tree. But generally, that's a pretty slow process. And remember, this is an insect that has a 2-year life cycle in many parts of the country. So that damage can be really slow. And the homeowner's not always going to associate it with an insect because they might think that that's something that would happen more quickly. I'm noticing that this insect in our city is very patchy. So there are particular neighborhoods where there are lots and lots of birch trees that are affected, and then in another neighborhood we might not see so many. One of the things that I am seeing in the neighborhoods that are most effective is that homeowners are trying to remove individual branches or parts of trees as a treatment for this. And again, that's not going to be effective. So the trees are not going to leaf back out because it's actually their vascular system that has been damaged here. But there's probably at least 4 or 5 instances I can think of where people are trying to address this with just taking out the tree or part of the tree, and that's not going to be effective. In your third picture here, again, we have another younger tree in this case, and this one is a really good example of that raised bark that you should be looking for, particularly in younger trees that might look like they're stressed. Most of this is going to happen at chest level and above. So it's pretty rare to see these symptoms on the first few feet of trunk. You want to look up at your chest level and above. And then last there you have, again, some pictures of the D-shaped exit holes. Notice on that last picture, the exit hole on the left and is an example of one that's not quite as D-shaped, is it, as the one on the right. So they're not always a perfect D, but when you see that perfect D, you can be sure that's what you're dealing with. Notice also on the bark there that there's a lot of yellow staining. And in my experience, it is easier to make out that yellow staining on the exit holes that are near the bases of branches on more mature trees. You tend to see more of it. But isn't that, again, something that we might see on a birch tree and not realize that that's staining? You know, they're not always pure white. There's some color variation there. So it takes a little bit of practice. Just seeing some yellow on the trunk in and of itself might not be problematic. But if you see that yellow staining along with those holes, or if you see yellow staining concentrated at the junction of where those branches meet the main trunk, for instance, that's a place to look at. And remember to start looking at those branches right at the above your chest height. All right, so now we start moving into what homeowners can do. Do you have questions right now, Brooke?
There are a few questions on the biology of the insect, if you have time to, okay.
Yes,
so Sandy has a question about the egg laying. Is it single eggs? How many eggs are laid in one area?
So they're usually laid just 1 or 2, maybe 3 in one area, so they'll travel around the bark of the tree. And that activity is going to happen on sunny days in the midsummer, depending on where you are. We have a slide that talks about some of those emergence times. The egg laying part is also very short compared to the rest of the insect's life cycle. So generally, once the adults emerge, they're probably only living 4 to 5 weeks max. They're going to start laying eggs about a week after they emerge. So you've got a pretty narrow window of actual egg laying going on. So that's another thing that kind of adds to the cryptic nature of this particular pest. Good question.
And then Jan wants to know, is there any evidence of the larva entering the tree, like frass? So we see some of our, wood boring beetles, they leave a lot of frass. From what you're describing, it sounds like a lot of that frass might be trapped under the bark. But
yes, so and the larvae are really small when they first burrow in. So in my investigations last summer, I did see some little tiny pinholes that I wondered if they were that larva burrowing in, but they're so small that I couldn't determine for sure that's what that was. And typically the frass isn't getting pushed out of the hole like it does on some pests. So some of you might have seen pictures where the trunk or the branch actually has like a sawdust toothpick sticking out. So ambrosia beetles, for instance, you see that sometimes, or you see sawdust at the base of the tree for some pests that might be a clue. I'm personally not seeing that. It seems like most of the frass is actually packed in the larval tunnel, which might be part of what's contributing to that disruption of the water and nutrients through the cambrium.
Jan would also like to know about where the larvae are attacking the tree. Is it just on that main, trunk of the tree, chest high and up? Are they scattered throughout branches? What patterns do you see?
So to the best that I can tell, that largely depends on how mature the tree is. So if it's a younger tree and the trunk is, maybe 6 inches wide or less, they tend to be going straight for the trunk. In the more mature trees, you are seeing that in those bases of the branches at the trunk. And it can be hard because sometimes they're up high in the tree, in a mature tree. So you're not going to see those exit holes necessarily high up in the tree, right? So it can be challenging. And I think that's another one of those things that makes it harder. Clearly, as they proliferate in a tree, there's going to be more holes and more opportunities for us to see, right? So it depends on where they tend to attract. So that's why we want to look for all those different clues. Do we have those individual flagging branches? Can we look up into the tree? Sometimes the yellow staining at the bases is going to be easier to see high up, right? That color we can see maybe easier than the holes. And then how exfoliating the bark is makes it harder to see some of those too. I have a hypothesis that the bronze birch borer doesn't like bark that exfoliates as much, and maybe that's why the river birch is not as susceptible, but that is just a hypothesis.
Ed wants to know how many larvae it takes to kill a tree. Like, have they ever done, a complete post-mortem to see like how many larvae are in one of these trees? Can you kill a tree with just one?
So I haven't seen any numbers that say, it takes just one. I would imagine it would only take a very few in a young tree, particularly if it wasn't getting adequate water. And I want to make sure that I mention water in dry areas as one of the things that we should be encouraging people to think about. Many of us don't even think, and certainly where I grew up in my career, where we get 30 to 50 inches of water a year, water in mature trees is not something that would necessarily be on my radar. But it seems that in trees that have adequate water, that in and of itself is probably the best defense. And the thought process there is that that freely moving sap where water is adequate may be drowning some of the larvae when they're really small before they can get a chance to take hold. So that's really important to think about in areas where trees may not be getting adequate water. And we know that the buprestids love a stressed tree. So if we can reduce the stress, we can make our trees less enticing. And some of the first trees that we think are kind of the key trees that started here in Klamath Falls were in a cemetery where when there was a drought and water restrictions, water was suddenly cut off to those very old trees. And we think those have been some of the first that were infested here. Good questions.
So there's two more, and I think you might be answering them in a little bit, so you can feel free to hold off on those. Rhonda wants to know about if one branch dies and is noticed, is there a chance to save the tree? And so you might be getting at that in a little bit.
I definitely am getting there.
Okay, so we'll hold that one. And then Barbara wants to know on the geographic distribution. So on the West Coast, she's in Washington State. Are you familiar with the spread, along the West Coast? You might be getting to that.
So actually, that's a good question. So I did check out a couple maps. So there are different tools that some of us extension and entomology folks can use to track the spread of pests so that we can kind of understand that better. And in general, those tend to be pretty good tools. But for the Bronze Birch Borer, it seemed like the maps that I could find were all pretty out of date, maybe as much as 8 to 10 years old in terms of having been updated. So I didn't feel like they were really helpful, and that's why I didn't include a distribution map for this pest, because I couldn't find one that I felt like was up to date. I think those are pretty useful tools. And that's why the first thing I did when I found some was send some to ODA, because, you know, that tends to be one of the mechanisms through which those maps are updated. So I can't speak to what the exact spread is. I wish I could. All right, so moving on then to what we might think about doing as homeowners. So one of the first things that we could do is call in a professional. One of the treatment options that we have is a trunk injection. Again, we're talking about a pest that is feeding inside the tree. That being said, even with a trunk injection, there are no guarantees, and that tends to be a pretty expensive option. So not everybody is going to be willing to do that. There is another option that involves treating the outside of the trunk. The purpose of that injection is to kill those larvae on contact before they have a chance to burrow underneath of that bark. That is a treatment that's going to be less long lasting in the tree, and it has a very narrow window. We're talking about probably 2 or 3 weeks for any given location in the summer, and we're talking about it being different in Iowa versus Maine versus Georgia versus here in Oregon, right? Because and I have a slide coming up that highlights that a little bit more. So this trunk treatment, which is something that folks can do themselves more easily, it is very important to time that appropriately, or it's completely useless. It's very much like treating for pecan weevil. You know, people used to bring me pecans in the fall after they fell and they realized they were infested with pecan weevil and want to know what to do. Well, the treatment for pecan weevil is on the trunk in the summer, in July. And so we have to remember to do it ahead of time, right? And after you realize that the pecans are done, it's too late. So timing, really, really important for that. So here in Klamath Falls, we are not able to recommend that particular treatment yet because we have no idea when that actual egg laying is happening here in our area. So, you know, I can't give you any idea really when that window is. So that treatment is not very likely to be helpful when we don't know when adult emergence is happening. So then the most popular in terms of success and application is actually treating systemically via the root zone. So there's in particular, two things that are helpful for this. So they're both neonicitinoids. One is imidacloprid and one is dinotefuran. I'll have the spelling of dinotefuran coming up as well. So those are treated at the root zone and pulled up into the tree so that when the larva feeds into the tree, it takes little bits of those insecticides up. So those are systemics. That means there is potential pollinator interaction, even though birches are wind pollinated. And these are not necessarily really easy to use. So if you think about a really large tree, and I've tried to help several homeowners with that, it's going to take that stuff a long time to get from the root zone 100 feet up into a really large mature tree. And again, in an area like Klamath where there's no rain, how is that stuff going to get from the root zone up into the tree if you're not watering it pretty regularly, right? More than one time. So that treatment, although it can be effective, if it's not done soon enough, the birch borer is still going to win the battle of the material getting up into the tree. I hope that makes sense. So back to your person's question, how soon does it have to be, right? So here we've got examples of some of the known emergence windows that I've been able to pull from the literature. So in Illinois, for example, that window is sometime in late May and early June. Okay. In Minnesota, it's early June. Canada, depending where you might be, the emergence might start in early June all the way to late August. I think that's really that wide of a window is because we're talking Canada. That's a pretty big geographical area, right? The U.S., if you try to generalize across the U.S., they're going to tell you anytime from May to August. Okay. The further north you get, that tends to be later. So we don't have specific adult emergent times for every area. Last year here, when I started suspecting that bronze birch borer was here, I did have one fabulous day where I found adults. And the place to find the adults is on the trunks or at the base of those branches when they're laying eggs. So most of them that you're going to find are going to be females. The males are generally up in the canopy, and the adults do feed on the leaves, by the way. It's just that the adults do so little damage. They're only alive for a few weeks, so they're not around long enough to do much canopy damage that we're actually going to notice. So last year, I found some adults at the end of June and immediately ordered some traps, and we started putting those traps out around Klamath Falls, and I never saw another adults. So between the end of June and when I actually got those traps out in the tree, they were done. So my plan this year is to get some traps out earlier and to trap for the next few years. We've got master gardeners and homeowners that are willing to let us put those out so that we can try to get some idea of what our window is. It would be intuitive that our window is going to be a little bit later than some other places since we have a shorter growing season and longer winter here, but we don't really know when that is. So one of my goals is to try to do some trapping over the next few years so that with multiple years of data, we can try to help figure out when that might be. And, you know, we've also got folks at OSU that do modeling for insects based on degree days so that we can try to predict when that might be. So there's opportunity to try to figure that out, but we don't necessarily know when that adult emergence is yet. All right, so can we prevent? Possibly. So probably our best opportunity for prevention is choosing a birch that's not as susceptible. If we already have a birch tree in our yards, it's going to be too late for that. So if we're in dry areas, we want to remember as a preventative to actually water our birch trees. That is not something that a lot of homeowners are going to do unless we can help get the word out. So remembering that buprestige generally tend to be drawn to older, stressed, or weakened trees. Trees are weakest when we first plant them for that first couple years, but till they get established, and then at the opposite end of the spectrum when they're older or there's a drought stress there. So again, that trunk treatment that we can apply can be helpful from keeping the larva from burrowing into the wood if it's present, but it has to be timed to when oviposition is going on. And generally that's a week after we start seeing adults. So in places when we have a pretty good idea when that is, that trunk treatment is not systemic and has less chances of having negative interactions with our bees and our pollinators than the systemic treatments would be. So here's a great visual that folks can use to kind of help figure out if treatment might be helpful. Remember, our most successful treatments are typically to the root zone and then have to be drawn up into the tree. So that needs some time to take place. So this larger picture here is trying to illustrate that if your tree's generally healthy, then that treatment's likely to be helpful. If you've got just a few branches that are showing defoliation or flagging, then that treatment is likely to be helpful. But when you start getting into 40% and more of the canopy, and some references will tell you 50%, but a lot of the pros that I've talked to tell you it's really more like 40, particularly in dry areas, then the chainsaw is unfortunately probably your best treatment because they're going to kill what's left of the tree before that product can really adequately get to where it needs to be and protect your tree. And then that picture on The right there is just an illustration of what that one weird branch might look like when you start to see those flagging branches, not as many leaves, they just look like they're dried up. That's a close-up of that factor that we want to look for there. So timing, again, is going to be really important here, and we might want to be thoughtful in terms of helping people understand that sometimes the best option is to cut the tree down, and that's what we run into with the emerald ash borer. That's pretty much the only effective thing in a lot of cases for that particular pest, and it's, you know, it's really sad. We've got some beautiful large mature landscape birches in our yards that are providing shade and other things. So some things that we can help people avoid: cutting out symptomatic limbs by themselves is not going to help. Remember that they're girdling that particular stem, but they are also feeding in the trunk. And so just cutting off that one branch is not going to help. I've even seen some trees that have been topped out as a response to bronze birch borer. That's not going to do it. So that's just a waste of finances and energy. Another thing that we can do to help people out is to make sure that we help guide them in terms of pesticide formulation. So I mentioned imidacloprid as being one of the primary pesticides. Imidacloprid comes in like 97 different formulations. And one of the things that we've run into here is people getting the wrong formulation. So it could have been something for lawn, or it could have been something for perennials. It's not going to be taken up by the tree appropriately, and it's not going to have the desired effect. Like any pesticide, got to encourage people to read the label. We had one gentleman here in Klamath Falls that killed his tree because he had the wrong formulation, and he mixed the entire bottle with 5 gallons of water and poured it in a trench around his tree, and it killed his tree within days. And, you know, I think his tree was probably still savable if he had used the right formulation. So he ended up spending hundreds of dollars having to have the tree removed. Okay. It's not worthwhile to try to treat the adults in the canopy. Again, they're there for a very short while. They're not the ones that are really doing the bulk of the damage, other than the fact that they're mating and laying eggs. But you're going to have a really hard time, particularly in a mature tree, to get a good canopy spray that would actually be helpful. You're probably going to interact with far more non-target organisms than you would with actual bronze birch borer. Also important to realize that we can spread this pest through firewood. So we're recommending, if the tree is past a certain point, to cut it down, but we don't want to spread it via that firewood. And then lastly, we do our neighbors a disservice by not treating, because eventually when it kills those birch trees, it's going to move on throughout the neighborhood. And we've seen some evidence of that in particular neighborhoods here, where you can almost figure out where the first tree was and extrapolate out from there. So it's really important that people do treat, because that's how we can keep it from spreading out past those individual neighborhoods. So again, the options are: cut it down if the tree is too far gone. This is one of those cases where that could be the best option. We've got that opportunity for injection. Those are systemic pesticides, to be clear, and need to be applied. Those particular ones with the tree injections need to be applied by a licensed applicator. The trunk application is carbaryl. That is not a systemic pesticide. It is not a neonicitinoid, but the timing is really important there. Carbaryl is also considered to not be most pollinator friendly, but applied just at the trunk at the right time, it's not likely to have that much interaction with our pollinators. And then our 2 soil drench opportunities are imidacloprid and dinoteffuron. Some of the challenges with those are pollinator related. So you guys know that imidacloprid and neonicitinoids are getting a lot of bad press right now because of the potential for negative interaction with our pollinators. So some things to think about as we navigate this particular situation with homeowners who might have heard of neonicitinoids and how horrible they are, according to the popular press. First of all, birch trees are wind pollinated. So bees are not the primary pollinators of birch trees. That being said, bees do still visit the flowers. And in looking for bronze birch borer last year, I noticed that bees still visit the flowers even after there's not very much pollen on them. So there is some potential interaction for bees to be exposed to these pesticides if they are expressed in the pollen, and if the bees interact with that pollen. However, when we research how these pesticides are expressed in the plant, the general test is looking at what is going on in the leaves. How long is that pesticide have a residual in the leaves? Because what are most of the pests eating? The leaves, not the pollen. So one of the things that's changing in the pesticide world is that these types of pests or tests, to look at how these chemicals are expressed in pollen are becoming more popular and are becoming more desired, but we don't have that information for very many trees or very many tree pesticide interactions yet. So many of you guys might remember the big bee poisoning that happened here in Oregon with tilia trees, and as a result, a lot more of that is being looked at, but we don't really know how much dinotephuron or imidacloprid is in a birch pollen or in the flower or in that pollen a year after we apply it, right? So we have a kind of catch-22 situation here. People want there to be a residual that stays in the tree a long time because that's what makes it effective against this pest. On the flip side of that, we don't want it to be expressed in the pollen because then there could be negative interactions with our pollinators. So some other things that come into play: how much water is going to be available to help it move through the tree? Is the correct rate used? When is the timing? So the best recommendation that we have for telling people to apply these is to do it after bloom, as soon as possible after the bloom, after the pollen is gone from the birch trees. That's how we can minimize the potential interaction with the pesticide and our pollinators. All right, so neonicitinoids, homeowners are starting to begin to reject those in some cases. People are asking for different opportunities. What's important to remember is that sometimes that is the best or only tool that we have available to us for a particular pest-plant interaction. Sometimes our homeowners are going to need some help with making sure that they have the right formulation of imidacloprid. It can be pretty tough to tell with so much information on the label sometimes. We want to make sure that they understand the instructions fully and how important it is to read those. Also, there is some evidence, and again, we're just starting to get good evidence in, but there is some evidence that the dinotephuron is not as persistent in the pollen as imidacloprid. So that would suggest that dinotephuron might be a better choice for those of us that are thinking about preserving our pollinators. However, the last time I checked, an imidacloprid treatment for a mature tree would probably cost between $30 and $40 if the homeowner bought the product and gave it themselves. And with the dinotephuron, it was about $150. That's a big difference. And so not everybody's going to be willing to pay that extra money for a product that might be better for the bees, and we don't have great evidence yet. So the choices are tough. It's like, you know, one treatment, you have to catch it at exactly the right time or it doesn't work. We can call the pros and it's going to be pretty expensive, or we can do these things. There's potentially some challenges there. But if we do nothing, bronze birch borer will kill the tree. And then it's going to spread and you're going to have unhappy neighbors. So this slew of challenges that people have to navigate if this pest is in their area are one of the reasons why I thought it was so important to get the word out in a format like this. This is really kind of a poster child for some of the hard choices that we have to make in terms of pesticide application. Because if we do nothing, it's just going to spread. So here's some of the things that our local program has been doing to help homeowners navigate this. One of the things that we did was actually get some logs. We peeled the bark back on some. We have large logs where we highlighted the emergent holes with highlighters so people could see what they look like. We made little tags that showed what they were. We peeled back the bark on some so that you could see those actual larval galleries. We had some smaller pieces where we didn't peel the bark back, where you could see those bumpy, warty pieces of bark so that we can show people what to look for. So we had those at our Arboretum Day here at our local Arboretum. We've had those on display at the local library with handouts. Just this last weekend, our master gardeners had those branches on display at our home show, along with some documents about the bronze birch borer, so that we could show people, here's what you need to be on the lookout for. Making sure, particularly in dry areas, that we stress the importance of watering. We've done a little bit of talk about this on the radio, and then got the word out to garden centers, made sure they had handouts that explained to people what to look for. We've keyed in on some of those neighborhoods. And again, we're going to be trying to do some trapping so we can identify when that emergence is going to happen, so that we can at least try to give people one other opportunity for a tool that might be helpful. So I hopefully have left, it looks like about 8 minutes or so for questions and discussion. I just wanted to leave this here so you can see that there are some good information out. There's other good information out there. We just had a guide to managing bronze birch borer come out last week from OSU, so that's one that I would recommend. There's some other opportunities there. And then if you go to the site bugwood.org, that's the second to the last, most of the pictures that you saw in this slide program came from that site with their permission. This is a great place to look at pictures to compare what you're seeing in your yard or what your homeowners might be seeing, or to pull those up and show those to homeowners that come into your Master Gardener plant clinics and say, here's what to look for if you don't have those physical samples on hand. Bugwood has excellent pictures that you can show people. So that is what I had to present, and I wanted to make sure there was time for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. And there are a few questions. So I am going to, Nicole is going to share her presentation, and so we will put that up on the eXtension Learn site, and I'll also pull these web links as well and post them so you don't have to write them down right now. So you'll be able to access that all. And anybody that participated, you'll get an email that will have a survey link as well. And so I'll make sure that you can find all of this information.
Thanks.
Yeah, so let's dive into a few of these questions in the time we have. One that came up by Carmen wants to know about the traps. What do you use for traps?
So it is a purple sticky trap, and basically they're just attracted to it. You put it up in the canopy of the birch trees and hope that the adults will land on it. So it's just a sticky trap that the bee prestids tend to be attracted to purple.
So no special pheromone attractant involved, just the purple?
There is not one for this pest.
Yeah, okay. And it's just a monitoring trap, correct? It's not something that someone could use to try to remove the beetles.
That's a great point. So yes, the monitoring traps are very different from those that would actually give control. And again, this is just to try to give us an idea of presence or absence, and it is not going to be effective in control. Good
Gotcha. Point. Thank you. So Rhonda would like to know, so you mentioned these different insecticide treatments, and so does the homeowner then need to treat this tree forever? Like, is this sort of a check the label and then make a reapplication for the life of the tree, or is this a one and done?
So it's probably going to be an ongoing situation with the injection, depending on the product that's used. My understanding is that might last as long as 2 to 3 years. And then with the other products, most of them say that they give a year of protection. So unfortunately, this is going to be an ongoing thing for those that want to protect their trees in area where this insect's a problem. Good question.
And so then Katie sort of brought up a point that I was curious about. So she's mentioning, you know, that birch trees tend to be native usually to riparian areas or areas where there is more moisture. And so maybe one of our recommendations for homeowners, excuse me, might be that maybe they consider planting a different species. Does that
Yes.
go into that whole IPM packet?
It does. So, and that's a great point. So here in Klamath, we get very little precipitation in the summer. And so our trees are like sitting ducks for this critter, for the bronze birch borer. And so that is particularly for people who lose a tree and are looking for something. If it's a dry spot, then we should be recommending something else. And if they just have their heart set on a birch tree, then they probably want to try to identify a moist spot or make sure they have an appropriate area for it, because that moisture is going to be helpful in prevention. And that situation where we tend to find them in moisture areas is probably why it doesn't kill native. This is an insect that's been here forever. We still have birch trees. So there's some natural check and balance that exists. And I would suspect that moisture plays a role in it.
So you had mentioned that this pest can be spread by firewood.
Yes.
So when a homeowner, the trees to the point where they need to cut it down, how do they then dispose of that wood so that they're not spreading it as, are there any recommendations?
So, if it's appropriate, we can burn it on site, right? You can also peel back the bark and expose the pupa and get rid of them. I mean, there's probably not gazillions of them like there would be with the skeletid. So the bark beetles that had that alternative gallery, they have much greater numbers typically in an infestation. So it would probably be really hard to get those guys out of there. But what we most don't want to do is to spread that firewood to another area where that pest isn't already.
Cheryl would like to know if there's any systemic organic pesticides that are effective, or just sort of are you aware? I know that you're not a researcher in this program, but are you aware of any research on alternative pesticides?
I have not been able to find anything yet. I've just started really digging because I do want to do some more research on this particular pest. I would really like to be able to fund measuring the chemical that's expressed in the pollen afterwards, so we had some idea of how long it's really there and how much potential for interaction there is. So I've done a little bit of literature review to that end, and I haven't come across any references to anything organic so far, but that doesn't mean it's not there. I haven't found it though.
And Sandra wants to know, and maybe other folks around the U.S. could speak to this as well in that chat, if there's any programs designed for local master gardeners who want to help with this surveying. So it sounds like, there's a lot of trees in your community and other areas. Are there ways that master gardeners can get involved to build these maps? And I'm not sure.
So I always find a way to brag on my kids, but I will say, like, once we started realizing this was here, even my kids could point it. They were like, "Is that one, Mom?" I'm like, "Yeah, that probably does." So I would say just in your drives around wherever you live, now that you know what to look for as the birches leaf out, to be aware of what to look for, you're going to start to probably notice pockets. So that would be one thing. And then, the samples that we got, I literally went to the homeowner's yard and asked if they would mind, and they had cut down a tree that had died from bronze birch borer, and he was more than happy to share some of his samples. So, if we can find opportunities like that, pictures are great, but there's nothing like having an actual sample to show somebody. So I would say those are ways to get out there. And I know master gardeners that are at all kinds of things like plant clinics and farmers markets and those kinds of things. So I would say just being able to talk with folks about it, particularly if you notice that damage in your area.
And so then we just have one last question in the box. And so it's talking about trees from the wild or from nurseries that are from like the interior of the United States, that they're more likely to be free of the larva than trees on the West Coast. And so I'm not sure if the question is getting at that you can purchase trees and have them shipped in But I don't know if that would keep these trees from being, you know, sort of reinfested if you already have that borer in your area. So yeah, that might be maybe more on the inspection side, like the nursery inspection of plant material moving. Yeah. But yeah.
And so it's important to remember that because this is a pest that is already native to the U.S., that level of inspection and restricting interstate movement is going to be a lower priority for our regulatory agencies than it would be if it was something that was introduced. So eventually it's going to spread where it wants to anyways, because it's always been here. So I think there's probably less focus on that in terms of regulatory agencies than other insects.
Great. So I think that's it for our questions, and we're sort of right on our time. And so if you could hear us all clapping, you would hear everyone clapping. And so we really appreciate you speaking on this topic. And so everybody look for an email that will have Nicole's newest publication. You can learn more about the biology of the insect and some of these management techniques. And then check in next month. We're going to have Jay Scheidt back, and he's going to talk all about powdery mildew and managing it in our gardens.
Cool.
So
thank you so much for having me, and I hope this was helpful for folks. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.